My name doesn't matter much for this, and honestly, after what I'm about to tell you, I'd rather not say it out loud anyway. I've been a caretaker at a small parish cemetery in southern Louisiana for going on 6 years now. I'm not going to tell you which one. There are dozens of little graveyards tucked between the bayous out here, and most of them look about the same from the road. Iron gates that haven't been straight since before I was born. Cypress trees draped with moss that hangs so low you have to duck under it when you're pushing the mower. Above-ground tombs gone soft at the edges from 100 summers of rain. If you've driven through this part of the state, you've passed a place like ours and probably didn't even slow down. I took the job because my uncle knew the man who ran it before me, and the man who ran it before me wanted out. His name was Earl. He was somewhere north of 70, with hands that looked like they'd been carved out of cypress root themselves, and he'd been the caretaker there for almost 30 years. When I met him, he was sitting on the tailgate of his truck, eating a ham sandwich, and he didn't stand up to shake my hand. He just looked me over and asked if I minded heat, mud, and being alone for long stretches. I said no to all three. He nodded and said the job was mine if I wanted it. The work itself is about what you'd expect. I trim grass between the markers with a string trimmer, and I push mow the open sections. I clear leaves in the fall, though down here that's more of a year-round thing, because the live oaks shed when they feel like it. I wash headstones with soft brushes and clean water, never anything chemical, because the older stones will pit if you hit them with the wrong soap. I repair the low fences between family plots when they lean too far. I pull fallen branches out of the cypresses after storms, which is most weeks between June and October. I check for vandalism, which is rare, and I prepare plots for visitors before holidays, which mostly means making sure the path is clear and the grass around their people looks tended. I keep my gloves and brushes and trash bags in a shed at the back of the property, near the drainage ditch. There's a notebook in the shed, too, hanging from a nail by a piece of twine, and the caretaker before me kept maintenance notes in it, and the one before him, and so on back. I add to it when something needs noting. Most of what's in it is practical. Northwest fence post rotted at base, replaced June 14th. Section by the magnolia floods after heavy rain, added gravel. Pump house lock sticks in cold weather, that kind of thing. On my first day, Earl walked me through the grounds. He moved slowly, partly from age and partly because that's just how you walk in a cemetery if you've been doing it long enough. You don't stride. You don't cut across plots. You follow the paths the families have worn between the stones over the years, and you let your eyes do the work your feet would otherwise rush through. He showed me the layout. The older section toward the front, with the above-ground tombs whitewashed every few years by descendants who still lived nearby. The middle section, mostly 20th century, with granite markers and the occasional concrete slab cracked by tree roots. The newer section in back, where the ground was softer, and the graves were marked with flat bronze plaques set level with the grass. He showed me where the water pooled, where the fire ants liked to nest, where I should park the truck so it wouldn't sink in after a storm. And then, near the end of the walk, he stopped at the edge of one of the older family plots and said, almost like he was telling me about a sticky lock, "Some graves should never be touched." He said it without lowering his voice. He said it the way he'd said the thing about the pump house. I waited for him to explain, because that's what you do when someone says something like that. But he just kept looking at the ground in front of us and chewing the inside of his cheek. After a moment, he said, "I'll show you which ones. You'll want to remember them. Don't write them down in the book. Just remember." We walked for another hour. He pointed out 7 graves in total, scattered across the cemetery with no pattern I could see. One was an above-ground tomb in the old section, the plaster gone gray, no name visible. One was a child's marker from the 1930s with a lamb carved on top. One was a plain granite stone from the 1960s. One was a recent grave, less than 10 years old, with a polished black headstone and no flowers. The other 3 were in the middle section, ordinary in every way I could identify. He didn't tell me who was buried in any of them. He just pointed and said, "That one, and that one, and that one over there by the oak." I asked him why. I felt like I had to. He thought about it for a long time, longer than I expected, and then he said, "Some families asked. Some of them nobody asks anymore, but the rule held anyway. You leave them be. Grass grows around them, or it doesn't. Leaves fall on them, or they don't. Doesn't matter. They're not your problem." I asked if there was a list anywhere. He said no. He said the man who trained him had walked him around the same way, and the man before that, and so on. He said if I ever trained someone, I should walk them around too. That was it. He shook my hand, told me to be patient with the heat, and drove off. I haven't seen him since, though I hear he moved up to Shreveport to live with his daughter. For the first year I didn't think much about the 7 graves. I just avoided them, the way Earl had. It wasn't difficult. Most of them were off the main paths anyway, and the grass around them stayed low enough that I could justify skipping them without it looking strange. If a visitor asked, I figured I'd say what Earl had said, family request. Nobody asked. But I started noticing things. Small things, the kind you'd dismiss if you only saw them once. The child's marker with the lamb on it never collected leaves. I want to be clear about what I mean by that. The grave was directly under a live oak. Every other marker in a 30-foot radius would be buried in leaves by November. I'd go out there with a rake and clear them, and I'd notice that the lamstone was clean. Not wind-cleaned, because the leaves piled up on the markers right next to it. Just clean, like someone had brushed it off that morning. I never saw anyone do it. I never saw footprints in the soft ground around it, even after rain. The above-ground tomb in the old section was the opposite. Grass grew tall around it on every side, the way it does around any unmaintained tomb, but it never grew on the slab in front, where you'd kneel if you were leaving flowers. That patch of dirt stayed bare, not scuffed, not worn, bare, like the ground had decided on its own that nothing would take root there. The polished black headstone, the recent one, would sometimes have flowers on it, fresh ones, usually white. I never saw who left them. The cemetery office keeps a visitor log, more out of habit than anything else, and I checked it more than once. No entries for that plot. No tire tracks I didn't recognize. The flowers would sit there for a few days and then be gone, and I never moved them, and I never saw anyone else move them either. I mentioned some of this to one of the older groundskeepers from the parish, a man named Theo who came out twice a year to help with the heavy work. I didn't say anything about Earl's warning. I just said, casually, that the lamstone seemed to stay clean on its own. Theo was loading bags of mulch into the back of his truck, and he didn't stop loading. He said, "That's the one by the oak, right? Yeah, don't worry about that one." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Earl tell you about the ones to leave alone?" I said yes. He said, "Then you already know." He didn't elaborate. He never did, on any of the times I tried to bring it up after that. Once, when I pushed a little, he said something I've thought about a lot since. He said, "The ones you're supposed to leave alone, you don't talk about them either. Talking's a kind of touching." I started reading the maintenance notebook more carefully after that. The notes from previous caretakers were almost all practical, the way I said. But here and there, scattered through the decades, there were entries that didn't quite make sense on first reading. Section C, plot uncertain, flowers cleared and replaced. That one bothered me. You don't have an uncertain plot number in a cemetery. Every grave has a number, and the office keeps the master records. Northwest corner, third row, do not log. I went and looked at the third row of the northwest corner, and the third grave in was one of Earl's 7. Family visit Saturday. Advise around plot 184. Plot 184 wasn't in the office records. I checked. The numbers in that section skipped from 183 to 185. I asked the office about it. The woman who runs the front desk, a kind woman named Miss Adele, who's been there longer than anyone, looked at the master book and said the numbering had always been like that. She said sometimes plots got renumbered when the layout was updated, and sometimes a number just got skipped because of a clerical thing decades ago. She said it like it was nothing. But when I pointed to the spot in the cemetery where plot 184 should have been, she didn't look up from her book. She said, "Oh, that's just the empty bit between the two family sections. Nothing there." There was something there. I'd been mowing around it for over a year. It was one of the 7. I want to say, before I go further, that I'm not a superstitious person. I grew up in a practical family. My father fixed boats for a living, and my mother taught 4th grade, and neither of them had any patience for ghost stories. When I noticed these things at the cemetery, I tried to find ordinary explanations for all of them. Maybe a relative was tending the lambstone in the early morning before I arrived. Maybe the flowers on the black headstone came from someone who walked in from the road and didn't sign the log. Maybe Miss Adele was just confused about an old plot number. None of these explanations were impossible. I told myself that more than once. But there were too many of them. And the men who'd done this job before me had clearly told each other, generation after generation, to leave certain graves alone, and they'd done it without writing it down, and they'd done it without elaborating. That kind of consistency doesn't come from superstition. Superstition is loud. This was quiet. This was the way you'd warn someone about a load-bearing wall. The hurricane came in my 4th year. I won't name it, because anyone from down here can probably guess which one. It came in from the Gulf and stalled over the parish for almost a full day, and when it finally moved on, the cemetery was a mess. 3 of the older live oaks had come down. Branches were everywhere. The drainage ditch had overflowed and pushed mud halfway across the back section. 2 above-ground tombs had cracks I'd need to monitor. The iron gate on the east side had been ripped off one of its hinges. I spent the first 3 days just clearing what I could reach with a chainsaw and a wheelbarrow. The office called and said an inspector from the parish would be out the following week to assess damage for insurance, and could I please have the grounds presentable by then. They didn't say it as a threat, but it was the kind of request that has a job attached to it. On the 4th day I worked my way into the older section. One of the fallen oaks had come down across a family plot and a heavy branch had landed directly on top of one of Earl's 7, the above-ground tomb, the one with no name. The plaster was cracked along the side now, and the branch was leaning against the slab in front, the bare patch where grass never grew. Mud from the overflow had washed up against the base. I stood there for a long time, looking at it. The branch was big enough that I'd need the chainsaw to break it down before I could move it. The mud would have to be shoveled out and the slab rinsed clean. The crack in the plaster would need to be assessed and probably patched eventually, though that was a job for someone with more skill than me. I thought about Earl. I thought about Theo saying talking's a kind of touching. I thought about Miss Adele saying nothing was there. And then I thought about the family in the plot next to it, whose grandfather's marker was half buried in mud because the tomb's runoff had pushed it that way. They'd be visiting before long. They always came in the spring, 3 generations of them, with folding chairs and a cooler. I couldn't leave their grandfather's stone covered. I started with the family plot. I shoveled mud carefully, working away from the tomb, trying to keep the wheelbarrow's path on the gravel. I rinsed the grandfather's marker with the soft brush and clean water. I straightened the small American flag they'd left in his stand, which had survived the storm somehow, leaning but not broken. But the branch on the tomb was still there, and as long as it was there, the mud would keep seeping back, and the family plot would stay half-flooded, and the inspector would see it, and I'd have to explain why I'd left a tree on a grave. I told myself I wouldn't touch the tomb itself. I'd just remove the branch. Earl had said leave them alone, and I'd left it alone for 4 years, and now the storm had done something I hadn't done, and I was just clearing what the storm had brought. That was the line I drew in my head. I would not clean the slab. I would not touch the plaster. I would only remove the branch. I cut the branch into sections with the chainsaw. The wood was wet and the saw bogged down twice. When the last section came free, it had been resting against the bare patch of ground in front of the tomb, and as I lifted it, a clump of leaves and mud came with it, smeared across that patch. The first time I'd ever seen anything on that ground. I told myself it didn't matter. I'd lift it off. I crouched down and reached for the smear of mud, and then I stopped, with my gloved hand maybe 6 inches from the ground, and I just stayed there. I don't know how long. Long enough that my knees started to hurt. The cicadas were going in the trees. A mosquito landed on my neck, and I didn't slap it. Then I brushed the mud off the patch with the side of my glove. Just that. One motion. The ground underneath was the same bare dirt it had always been. I stood up. I loaded the branch sections into the wheelbarrow. I walked back to the shed. That night, when I got home, I sat on my porch with a beer and tried to figure out what I felt. I didn't feel afraid. I want to be honest about that. I didn't feel like something was watching me, or like I'd done something terrible. What I felt was the way you feel when you've signed a paper without reading it. A small, low awareness that something had moved that I couldn't see. The next morning, I went back to work. The inspector came that Tuesday, walked the grounds, made some notes, and left satisfied. The family came 2 weeks later for their spring visit, brought their cooler, sat with their grandfather, and waved to me as I passed in the truck. The cemetery looked good. As good as it ever does after a storm. It took me about a month to start noticing. The first thing was the lambstone, the child's marker. I came around the corner of the path one morning in late April, pushing the trimmer, and I saw that leaves had collected on it. Not many, just the usual scatter of live oak leaves you'd expect under a tree in spring. But it was the first time in 4 years I'd seen leaves on that stone. I stood there with the trimmer idling and looked at it. Then I shut the trimmer off and went and got my brush and cleaned the leaves off the way I would for any other marker. As I was brushing, I noticed that the carving of the lamb looked softer than I remembered, like the stone had weathered more than it should have in one season. The next thing was the plot numbers. I went into the office to drop off some paperwork, and Miss Adele had the master book open on her desk. I glanced at it the way I always did, and I noticed that section in the northwest corner, the one where the numbers had skipped from 183 to 185. The book now showed 183, 184, 185, all in sequence. I stared at it. Miss Adele looked up and asked if everything was all right. I asked her as casually as I could when they'd updated the numbering. She frowned and said they hadn't. She said it had always been like that. I went out to the northwest corner. The grave that had been one of the 7, the one I'd been mowing around for 4 years, had a small concrete marker on it now. Old, weathered, set flush with the ground. A name was carved on it, but the name was hard to read. The letters had been worn down, or maybe never deeply cut. I crouched and traced them with my finger. It might have been a man's name. It might have been a woman's. I couldn't tell. I went home that night and didn't sleep well. The next morning I walked the cemetery before starting any work. I walked it slowly, the way Earl had walked it with me on my first day. I went to all 7 of the graves he'd shown me. 6 of them were the same as they'd always been. The limestone now collected leaves, but it was still there. The plain granite from the 60s still stood. The polished black headstones still sat without flowers, though I noticed I hadn't seen white flowers on it in weeks. But the tomb, the above-ground tomb with no name, the one I'd cleared the branch from, it looked cleaner than it ever had. The mud was gone, of course, but more than that, the plaster looked brighter, almost as if someone had whitewashed it. The crack from the storm was still there, but the whole structure looked tended in a way I'd never seen. And on the front of the tomb, in the spot where a nameplate would normally go, there was now a plate, bronze, dulled with age, a name on it. I leaned in to read it. The letters were worn, the way the letters on the small concrete marker had been worn, but I could make out a first name. It was a common name. It was, in fact, my grandmother's name. I want to be clear that I don't think it was her grave. My grandmother is buried in another parish, and I visit her every Christmas. But the name was hers, and seeing it there made my stomach turn in a way nothing else in this whole story had. I went back to the shed and looked through the maintenance notebook, page by page, all the way back to the oldest entries from the 1970s. I read every line, and in the back of the book, on a page I'd never paid attention to, because it had only one entry on it, in handwriting I didn't recognize. There was a note that said, "Tomb in old section, plaque restored after storm of 78, family unknown, do not log, do not clean." The handwriting wasn't Earl's, it was older than that, but underneath it, in pencil, in handwriting that was clearly Earl's, someone had added, still holding, "Leave it." And underneath that, in handwriting I almost didn't recognize because I never see my own writing in print, was a single line that said, "Cleared branch after storm, brushed mud from front slab." I had not written that line. I had no memory of writing that line. but the handwriting was mine. The pencil was the same pencil that hung on the twine by the notebook, and the date next to it was the day after the hurricane. I sat in the shed for a while. Then I closed the notebook and hung it back on the nail. I've been doing this job for 2 years since then. I haven't quit. I thought about it for a long time, but I came to understand that quitting wouldn't undo what I'd done. The next caretaker would just inherit the same notebook, with my handwriting in it and the same 7 graves, except now one of them looks better than the others and has a plate with a name that wasn't there before. And the lambstone collects leaves now, and I clean them off, and the polished black headstone hasn't had flowers on it in 2 years, and somewhere else in the cemetery, a grave I'd never noticed before, an ordinary granite marker in the middle section, has started to keep itself strangely clean. I think what Earl was trying to tell me, and what the man before him was trying to tell Earl, is something I didn't understand until after I'd already broken it. I thought the 7 graves were being protected because something terrible was buried in them. I thought the warning was about danger, but I don't think that's what it is. I think those graves were being left alone because leaving them alone was the way the cemetery had agreed to remember them, or to forget them. I'm not sure there's a difference in the end. The bare patch in front of the tomb wasn't a sign that something was wrong with the ground. It was a sign that the ground had been allowed to settle into a particular kind of stillness, and that stillness was doing a job, and the job was holding something in place that wasn't a person and wasn't a spirit, but was more like a gap, an empty shape that the cemetery had grown around, the way a tree grows around a fence post. When I cleared the branch and brushed the mud, I didn't disturb anything that was buried there. There may not have been anything buried there. What I disturbed was the gap, and the cemetery, which has its own slow way of keeping its books, adjusted. It put a name on the tomb. It filled in the missing plot number. It started letting leaves fall on the lambstone because the lambstone wasn't carrying the absence anymore. Something else was. Something else now is. I don't know whose grave is keeping itself clean these days. I've stopped trying to find out. I think looking for it would be another kind of touching. I still maintain the cemetery. I still trim the grass and clear the leaves and wash the older stones with soft brushes and clean water. I still eat my lunch in the truck with the windows cracked, and I still slap mosquitoes off my arms in the late afternoon. The work is the work. Most of it is ordinary, and most of it always will be. But I've added a few graves to the list of ones I don't touch. They're not the same graves Earl showed me. The list shifts. I check it in my own quiet way every spring. I notice which markers stay clean on their own, and which patches of ground refuse to grow grass, and which plot numbers Miss Adele's book skips over without explanation. I move around them. I don't write them down. A few months ago, the cemetery hired a young man to help me with the heavier work, and they've told me that within a year or 2, I'll probably be the one training my own replacement. I've already thought about what I'll say to him. Not much. I'll show him the pump house and the soft ground by the magnolia and where to park the truck after a storm. And then, somewhere near the end of the walk, I'll stop at the edge of a plot and tell him, in the same voice I'd use for anything else, that some graves should never be touched. He'll ask me why. They always do. I'll think about it for a moment, the way Earl thought about it, and then I'll tell him what I wish someone had told me clearly before I learned it the other way. I'll tell him that a cemetery isn't only a place where people are buried. It's a place where the living and the dead have worked out a long, quiet arrangement about what gets remembered and what gets allowed to fade. Most of our job is helping that arrangement along, but some of it, the older parts, the parts that were already settled before any of us got here, those parts are already doing their work, and our job is to recognize them and step around them. I'll tell him that if he's not sure whether a grave belongs on the list, he should err on the side of leaving it alone. I'll tell him that doing nothing is sometimes the most careful thing a caretaker can do. And in the notebook in the shed, on the last page, in pencil, I've already written the line I want him to find when he looks for it. It says, "Do not fix what the cemetery has chosen to leave alone." I hope he listens. I hope he's better at it than I was. I hope when he walks the grounds in his first spring that the lambstone is still collecting leaves, and that he cleans them off without thinking too much about it, and that the rest of what's holding stays held. That's all I have to say about it. The sun's going down, and I've got an early start tomorrow. There's a family coming in on Saturday for their mother's anniversary, and I want to make sure her plot looks the way she'd want it to look. That part of the job, at least, is still simple.